Thanks, Andrea. I'm glad to be here. I was asked to speak about how we use language resources at the Commission to provide our machine translation system, which has been up to now MT at EC, and which, while MT at EC will continue to exist in parallel for a short time, which will be switching to eTranslation Wednesday next week. So let me tell you then what we have today, of course, is MT at EC, which many of you know. Moses-based statistical machine translation, which when we started it in, started work on it in 2010 or so, was the new paradigm taking over from the rule-based machine translation, which we had before. It's within our remit to cover all 24 EU languages. Currently, we have 78 direct language pairs, everything into English, a lot into French, and vice versa, and then a few Czech, Slovak, Spanish, Portuguese for similar languages. Domain-specific engines. This is part of the remit of CEF, part of the remit of ELRC. What we have within MT at EC is very basic in the sense that certain agencies, the European Chemicals Agency, the European Medicines Agency, have provided us with data, and we've built engines with that data, specifically for their documents, which are very heavy on terminology and have very little else. It means that if you take a normal, even a press article on medicines, and run it through, you will get a very poor translation. It's really very specifically targeted at a specific type of document. And we have to broaden that with eTranslation. So I said we started work in 2010. The official launch was on the 26th of June, 2013. And it's used by EU institutions, websites, and public administrations. Now, what did we build it with? Part of the motivation for building our own machine translation system was the fact that we have a very large body of translators, 1,700 translators at the Commission, smaller numbers at the other institutions, but still in the hundreds. And we have a virtuous circle, if you wish, where, okay, when I started 19 years ago now, we were at the stage where people were working on their own computers, usually with Word. A few pioneers were starting to use Translator's Workbench. Normally they would keep their own memories, build up their own memories of the documents that they had done themselves. This is where what I mentioned before, the idea that my translations are the best. You could see people did not want to pollute their perfect translation memories with things from other translators. But we moved away from that and created Euramis. Well, Euramis existed already as the database of translated segments. All of the official translations that are done within the Commission, but also the Parliament, the Council, the committees, the other institutions, go through this system and are fed back into the system. We currently have over 1 billion segments, covering all of the EU languages, and lately we've been trying to broaden that because, of course, we also have to translate from Arabic, Russian, Turkish, Chinese. That required some technical adaptation because of the different structures of the languages, and there's still small amounts, so we have not actually built any engines with that data. And nonetheless, it's growing at about 2.6 million segments per month. This is what our workflow looks like. It looks a bit scary, but people only ever actually have to deal with small components of it at a time. So you have the Commission department at the top, if you wish, which needs a translation and will make the translation request through poetry. Okay, you may argue about whether our documents are poetry or not, but that's the name of the application. Then they move to Mandesk, so a desk for managers where managers can check demand management, who is free, who is not free, and get assigned to translators. Once that happens, or actually at the Mandesk stage, once it's in there, automatically the documents are compared against the central Euramis database. All of the relevant segments are extracted. If the document is based on a certain regulation, you'll have that document aligned, that regulation aligned as well. And those are prepared right now in a directory so that when the translator starts his work on his project, the resources are immediately there. They don't have to do any research. They may like to, they may find that there are additional documents which would help, but they have a substantial quantity of resources already available. Euramis, in addition to storing the data, it also has a concordance function, search functions, and the note, which is referred to here in Tradesk, is a way for translators to communicate between institutions. Because with the co-decision procedures that we have, with consultations between the institutions, you will get a document translated at the Commission, going to the Parliament, being adapted at the Parliament, coming back, arguments about terminology and so on. So this allows them to resolve these issues. And then, then it goes back into the bureaucratic circuit, Tradesk, directly to the translator, who works to complete the translation. As a rule, translations are supposed to be revised before moving on. It's generally the case. Some departments are very strict about it. I know that when I was a translator, if things were really, really late and you didn't have time to find a reviser, and sometimes things do go out without that level of quality control, you have to be very careful if you're going to take that risk, because it might be okay for a 2-page press release, but if you do it for an 80-page regulation and there are errors in it, you will be slapped down. So I never took that risk. And of course, once the translator finishes, has completed the translation, which has been revised, there is a tool added on to Studio, which will automatically upload that specific translation memory. So basically the document which has just been translated, and only that document, I refer to the gentleman's question about what is contained in the translation memory. So only that document aligned is fed back into Euramis. And that accounts for the 2.6 million segments that it grows more or less every month. And then there's a bureaucratic procedure where it goes back to Mandesk to go back to the department to the final requester. I've been a requester just recently doing the help pages for the new eTranslation, actually. And I have to say that the note, for the translators it was very helpful because they could ask a lot of questions. For me it was a little bit irritating sometimes, but I can see the value in communicating directly, just the questions can go on for a long time sometimes. But they were also building on the previous help files from MT@EC, which were translated 4 or 5 years ago, so there was actually not that much translation to be done, and it came back very quickly. So I think you can imagine that this is really a treasure trove of Eurospeak. Okay, if you need to be compliant with something, if you need to have implementing measures, if you want something harmonized, we're the guys to come to. On the other hand, normal newspaper articles and so on, that's not really the case. Now I've got an example here, which I did put through the machine translation system, although this is a screenshot. Council decision from English into French. It's pretty well perfect. There may be some tiny grammatical errors. I read through it quickly, but it's our jargon, it follows it. Mostly because this is pretty well boilerplate stuff. The numbers change, the dates change, but it's almost always the same right at the beginning. Now, I haven't talked about machine translation yet. So, within the system that I described before, once MT@EC existed in 2013, Of course, we wanted translators to use it, otherwise what's the point? But we also wanted translators to buy into it, to use it at their volition. So we asked language departments to opt in. And we got the first ones, who were the Portuguese, who had been pioneers on their own, to the extent that an enthusiast in the Portuguese department had set up a computer in the corner where people could go with their USB sticks to get a machine translation. The Romanians, the Bulgarians adopted it quite quickly. Currently, all the language departments now use machine translation, with a couple of exceptions. The adoption, let's say, in time sequence went, as you would expect, from the languages which were well served, Latin languages, not morphologically complex languages, down to, okay, Finnish, Estonian, where you had a few experimental people who would stick with it, down to Hungarian, where the last I checked, before we started a little pilot project, I had about 100 segments, which to me looks like one guy tested it once and said, oh my God, I'm never going to use this again. Hungarian, with the statistical approach, was very, very poor. And Irish, which is not used at all. Apparently that's a policy in the Irish department currently, but that would have to be verified if that's changed. With Hungarian, so what happens now when a document comes in, it goes to Euramis to get a translation memory, but that document is also submitted automatically to MTIDC so that you have a TMX which contains the machine translation available. The translators can then opt to use that MT-TMX file in their project or not. Again, the high adopters, the ones who adopted machine translation first, use it almost all the time, which using it means it's there as one of the things that can be looked at, because they may find that none of the machine translation selections are good, and they may simply end up using translation memory suggestions throughout certain documents. It's possible. Or in other cases, they may use machine translation for 70% of the segments in that document. So, I mentioned that we're very good with Eurospeak, which I think is no surprise to everyone. This is an example that I'm quite fond of. In English, the chair had a broken leg. This was an example that was given to me by the Online Dispute Resolution System, the ODR. Consumer complaints across borders. The chair, you go to a shop, you buy a piece of furniture, you unpack it, put it together, sit down, bang, the chair breaks. Unfortunately, in our context, we don't talk very much about places people need to sit. What we talk about is the chair of a meeting. Because gender-neutral language, we don't talk about chairman, chairwoman. We talk about who's chairing the meeting and the chair of the meeting. Le président in French. This crosses almost all of the languages. I didn't put them all here. I don't know if there's any Danish speakers. And even the Greek example, it's all the same. It's a big problem for the system that we have built with the data that we have. Okay, we call it our general engines, but in fact they're enormous domain-specific engines covering the European legal domain largely. So we need to break this EU bubble, which we've been working to do also on our own, but mostly through ELRC lately. In the past, with MTIDC, we've received data from various bodies, the Finnish Prime Minister's Office, from Norwegian, Icelandic Ministry, the German Bundesbank, the agencies that I mentioned beforehand. It's very nice, but there are a lot of issues with this. It's not easy to use at all, because we get, first of all, in every case, it's how do we deliver this? Do you have an FTP server? Can we just send you a stick by email? Oh, this guy's going to your country next week on a mission. Can you meet him and pass a stick to him and so on? Then the TMX files, they may be TMX files, but even the TMX files, depending which version of the software, CAT tool software they're using, whether they've added additional tags in their environment that don't match with ours. We have to adapt to that. And we didn't have any sort of real, we had a record that we had a delivery, the file name was this, from Iceland in May of 2016, but we didn't really have an idea of what it contained. And we subsequently got another delivery through ELRC in this time, which was about double the size. So we thought, well, this is great. We'll have about 1.5 million segments. But of course, then the next delivery, we had to manually do a check, compare what matches, what doesn't match. And we got additional data through ELRC, but it also contained the 500,000 segments we had already received. So this ad hoc approach, which we were happy to do it when we were doing it, because it enabled us to broaden our base a little bit, but it's not sustainable. It can't be done on any sort of large basis. You need a sort of a centralized system which provides data in a format which we can build, and through that provide a service which is useful to a broader part of the population. So the fact that we get regular, consistent, and clear deliveries, which are clearly identified and structured, is important. And the other thing, we didn't do this on a large scale, but legal clearance is also an issue. There are bodies that will deliver data only for use by the Commission. There are other bodies which will say this is open data, which can be available to everyone, other machine translation providers, language researchers, universities, and so on. Our goal is to build more domain-specific engines and to do regular updates on them. I want to have an engine which knows that when you're contacting a consumer body to complain about a purchase and you have a chair, it's probably something to sit on. But we don't have a predefined schedule because we are dependent on when does this data arrive, how much is available. If we get something that has 5,000 segments, it's good for the future, but to make it worthwhile to build an engine, we need larger amounts. And then there's always the question, do we create a separate engine, or do we just add it to the data that we already have? Our intention for Irish is to add the additional data that we can get through ELRC to data that we already have. Because Irish, as you saw in Teresa's presentation, has not been a full-fledged procedural language in the Commission, which means it does not have the amount of resources available that most of the other languages have. To give you a ballpark figure, we had 1 billion. English, French, we have around 100 million, 110 million. The bulk of the languages which are not procedural languages, we have between 40 and 60 million segments. And Irish, we have about 3.5 million. So it's really, the amount is low in comparison. Okay, so where are we moving? What will change? First of all, we're going to be cloud-based. This is not just because, well, the cloud is cool. It's actually for a very specific reason, which is up to now we've been based in the Commission data center run by Digit, the Directorate General, which provides all IT infrastructure. But they have no interest in providing GPUs, graphics processing units, which you need to be able to do, neural translation. And of course, it's much more scalable, much more adaptable. On the Commission MTIDC system, we've been running on the same 6 computers since 2000, well, a total of 6 since I think 2012. They're end of life now. They can be changed. If I needed another one, I would get in, put in a request, look for the budget, 3 months' time, perhaps get it, that sort of thing. Here we can scale up and down and get machines immediately. decommission them when they're no longer needed under times of heavy load. The standard cloud advantages and the standard cloud disadvantage, which is the fear about security. Currently, we're launching next week, but we will not be processing any sensitive documents at that time because we have to harden the cloud. We'll be able to use it for normal documents, letters from the public, press releases, those sorts of things. But internal documents, legislation in progress, will continue to go through MT@EC. We're currently working with Digit and Accenture to basically create a private cloud within the public cloud. This is coming to its conclusion, which is very good to hear. I have to report on it at the end of this month, so I'm very glad that this is the condition it's in. However, the point where we're arriving at the end of this month is the point that was promised to me by Digit. They felt that they could provide the security plan by the end of December 2016. And I'm getting it at the end of November 2017. And then we have to implement. But I think I'm scheduling a complete or a switchover of the front end. So MT@EC as a website will probably disappear towards the end of the first quarter of next year, and you'll go through the eTranslation webpage for those of you who use it. What does the eTranslation webpage look like? Well, for snippets, this is what it's going to look like. It's basically, it's redesigned on the MT@EC webpage. And the big advantage, I think, apart from speed and so on, is the neural engines which are being developed. We will launch with English into German, English into Hungarian, and English into German and Hungarian and vice versa, and English into Finnish and English into Estonian in November. Now, I've taken a couple of examples here just to compare the two. We heard a lot about neural machine translation, I'm sure yesterday when I wasn't here, but also this morning. The fact that neural systems are now winning all of the competitions. At the Commission, we've gone through various phases of fear. We heard on the panel before that the introduction of Translators Workbench, first of all, was greeted with a little bit of trepidation. Subsequently, machine translation, statistical models, the same thing happened. Then people started to work with it and were reassured. And now, with neural machine translation, the same sort of fears are arising again. That said, if we just compare, okay, I've taken an article and pumped it through both MT@EC, and you can see things that we just do not handle. In German, the Prince of Wales private estate, we don't recognize it at all. And the German, for those who speak German, it's very choppy and hard to grab the actual meaning of the sentence, although most of the words are there. Now, in this case, the neural machine translation of the same text, it recognizes a word the statistical system did not. This is through the bi-pair encoding, actually, that was referred to previously, I think. And it's understandable and reads acceptably. I did do the other way around because I thought there would be more English speakers here. This is a text about the political jockeying in Germany now to form a new government with the head of the Green Party. And again, we have the statistical output into English and the statistical output into, and the neural output into English in the second case. And frankly, I think this shows that there are clearly cases where neural machine translation is not going to provide the best translation. MT@EC, with Göring-Eckardt during the interview, that would be suicidal for our party. You have a decent translation, let's say, the neural system has really overcompensated, taking the Ecke in Eckhart and turned it into Corner, and I guess decided to ignore the heart. So you have Goring, Kerner of the interview, which is nonsensical. And again, the suicide for our party, it was more creative with the translation. That's very nice, but in fact, the literal translation is better. So, and then again, it overcompensated when we speak about Der Grünen in the first is the Green Party, which MT@EC properly rendered, or at least acceptably rendered as the Greens. And the neural system said, Greens, okay, it must be a green paper, and it went too far. So it's not going to put any translators out of a job yet, I think. Probably that worry is not so widespread here. On the other hand, with regard to the Hungarians that I mentioned before, the fact that they had not used machine translation at all, or almost at all, for the statistical models. We've been running a pilot with them from April of this year on smaller machines off on the side, little home built put together with sticky tape. But it's got quite a good reaction, and it did follow the typical hype curve. If you know the hype curve, they were there saying, finally, we've got machine translation. This is fantastic because they compared it to what they saw before. And then as they began to work with it, they saw, okay, it's a lot better, but there's still plenty to do. There are these problems of over-translating, if you wish. And there are the problems that were evoked again this morning, which is, okay, it reads fine, but it's actually wrong, which is, it's very misleading. It's a danger for translators, I think. Okay, and that is, thank you, what I have to present to you. Thanks.
eTranslation is a neural network model, I guess, and MT@EC is the SMT, the statistical model. I was just wondering whether the same training data has been used for MT@EC and for eTranslation, because it seems, so I'm from Sistran, and Sistran is also developing a neural machine translation, and it seems weird to me that the neural network with the same training data is making this kind of mistake for the proper name for Goring-Eckhart. So I was just wondering whether you have used the same training data or if there is any difference in the training process. And I have a second question. What kind of framework did you use for the neural machine translation model? Thank you.
You're welcome. First of all, for the training data, the neural network is trained on a subset of the total training data, because MT@EC is trained on the data from all the institutions, but given that we don't have full security in place, or enhanced security in place on the cloud, because we have to train on the cloud, I got permission from the directors within the Commission to use Commission data, but we have not yet approached the other institutions. So it's built on a subset, which could explain not knowing the Eckhart name, potentially. Now, with regard to the toolkits, we've been looking at all of the toolkits. We were heavy on Nematus for a while, which has since been abandoned, I think. I believe this is still built on Nematus. We test all of them. The other favorite currently, I think, is OpenNMT. But I'm pretty sure this one is Nematus here. Yeah?
I would like to hear about the views on incremental training a little bit. And I was wondering if the feedback that Google Translate has, and also the feedback system that Mika Nieminen told us about this morning, if you had any thoughts about doing the same kind of smooth and easy feedback for the future in MTHCC. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, with regard to incremental training, we experimented a little bit with it with Moses. And with the hardware we had, it basically took too long. So we never got anywhere. It's something that we want to look at. It should be much easier with neural systems because they just keep going through iterations, so you can add data in and do it regularly. But we haven't taken any concrete steps towards it, but we should and will. With regard to corrections and direct feedback, we don't have any system for incorporating that sort of feedback. It's within the machine translation system itself. What we've been looking at the Commission is within Studio, Trados Studio, which is the standard tool for the translators, is incorporating that through various plugins that are available, which means that a change that a translator makes within the document they're working on would carry through. It doesn't mean that that change would be immediately change the whole engine as it exists. If enough translators make the same change just by the fact that it keeps happening, it will come in and take over time for the baseline engines. The other thing that we're doing is kind of a different approach to doing the same thing, because it's nice to ask for feedback from users directly, but you do get competing changes and you get people changing things back and forth. And there have also been tales of people changing things just for fun to wreck translations. I don't think that would happen in a professional environment. I hope it wouldn't, maybe a couple of weeks before retirement. But what we do is we harvest when a translator completes the translation, there's the TMX file and an SDLXlif file, which is generated as well, which I didn't mention in the data circle that I presented. We harvest the SDLXlif file. We check which segments were machine translated, and then we look for, okay, in the Finnish translations, from English into Finnish, what are the common changes that are made compared to what we originally offered? So we're kind of looking for changes that translators make, but from the side. They're not actually telling us, I want this to change. They're making the post-edit, and then we look at it. We're kind of halfway through that, in that we're capable of harvesting the SDLXlif file. We're capable of parsing it, looking at the segments, and finding common editing patterns. What's a little bit disappointing is that we don't find very many common editing patterns. We find that people do all sorts of stuff all over the place. In the past, we made a big effort to regularize things to EU style. So those things are already solved, and now we're looking really at stylistic issues. And of course, the translation engine that we have is nowhere near perfect, but a really clear pattern of this has to be changed to this, we haven't yet detected it.